My name is Eddie Barron, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Clark. Dr. Clark got his undergraduate degree right here from OU, from the Homer L. Dodge Department of Physics and Astronomy. It wasn't called that at that time, but it is now. From there, he went on to get his PhD from Columbia. Now I need my cheat sheet. He is chief scientist of flight systems at Lockheed Martin. And he's had a long and storied career working on a variety of NASA missions, working on X-ray fluorescence in the Viking mission. He's worked on the Giotto mission, studying Comet Halley. He has won numerous awards, and we have brought him here to give him an award, but also he is going to share with us some of his insights. So let's welcome Dr. Clark.
Thank you very much, Ed. Appreciate that. So when I went from here at OU to the University of California at Berkeley to do what turned out to be my master's work before going on to Columbia, I was a little bit worried going from a middle location state-supported school to a place like Berkeley, which although it's state-supported, it had very stringent enrollment requirements and so forth, and a very high-powered university. We had like 6 Nobel Prize winners on campus teaching. So I was worried about my grades. It turned out my grades were better at Cal. So the education I got here at OU was really fabulous and really prepared me in so many different ways, and I really feel that it's the foundation of my career. But my career has jumped around to some extent, but not that I moved from place to place so much once I got settled, but in terms of being involved in a lot of different missions. I'm going to talk mainly about Mars today, but I'm going to tie it in with one of my great interests, which is biology. I actually switched, I was physics, then nuclear physics at Berkeley, and then by the time I went to Columbia after being in the Air Force for 3 years and working with some biologists, I decided I wanted to be a biophysicist, and that's what I did at Columbia. So that's why I have this kind of screwball title, and as we go through it, it might become a little more apparent what it really means. So it started out with a physicist. You know, when we look up at the stars at night, people have wondered, since ancient times, what are those things? What is our place in this universe? What is going on? What is the meaning of life, and so forth? And although we can see 1,000 stars, there's really way more numbers of stars. There's like galaxies of stars, and there are literally, it turns out, like 100 billion galaxies out there, and each galaxy's got 100 billion or maybe 1 trillion stars in it, average of 100 billion maybe. You multiply all those numbers together, and what I noticed is you're pretty much up at Avogadro's number for the number of stars in the universe. And so people have wondered for a long time, there's that many stars, and quite a few of them may have planets, and now we know that most of them probably have planets. Why couldn't they have civilizations and so forth? So there was a physicist named Enrico Fermi. He was born and died in the 20th century, and therefore it's sometimes said he was, some people feel that he was the greatest physicist of the 20th century, even though he had so many other great physicists that overlapped before and after. And by the way, could I have a little show of hands here? I'm curious if there are engineering people here as well as scientists. So how many engineers are here? A few. Okay. The rest of you are in science. And is it more physicists? How many people are physicists? Oh, okay. Okay, well, you're going to get some biology whether you want it. So Enrico Fermi actually built the first nuclear reactor. This was part of the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. He did many, many other things. He was in Mason physics and so forth. But at lunch one time, he asked some colleagues, where is everybody if we're not alone? because by then everybody felt that we must have other civilizations. So this is known as the Fermi paradox. And it's actually very famous in terms of one of the unknown unknowns in the universe. Why haven't we heard more? So there's a whole organization called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, who listens and tries to detect these other civilizations. So the answer could lie in the probabilities. Maybe even though there's zillions of stars, there's a pretty low probability that some of them are trying to communicate with us. First of all, you have to start life, and this is a classical unsolved problem in biology, because you have a number of different chemistries that have to get started, and then they have to work together to actually create a living entity. Then what is created, the life that you have on that object, must survive long enough for highly intelligent life to come about. Now, we know that there are lower forms of life that are pretty intelligent, like dogs that outsmart us and turn us, where they become the master and we become the slave. But the reality is that the kind of intelligence that you have to do technology and to search for life in other places requires something very unusual. It only happened on Earth after 3.5 million years of evolution. The life itself started in only the first half or maybe 1 billion years of history. So the intelligent life must become technical. It must become economical so that it can spend resources on searching for other life. It must stay motivated. It has to avoid being extincted. And I'll talk more about that before we're away. So some probabilities of these things, I've actually got high probabilities here compared to reality. Maybe life starts on 1 out of every 100 stars. I doubt it. And intelligent life doesn't just happen. It takes some time. And for the intelligent life to be as intelligent as we humans are, maybe a very low probability, a very uncertain thing. But overall, this is only 10 to the minus 6. And you bounce that against Avogadro's number of stars, and it seems like the universe must be teeming with life. But we're not hearing from it. So now let's look at, well, maybe we can learn on Mars how easy it is to start life, and that would help us with that first probability up there. So there's been a long history of exploration of Mars based on that premise. And the first one to go down to the surface was this Viking mission. And this is Carl Sagan. He's got his hand right on top of the instrument I developed for Viking. This is an X-ray fluorescence system. That black thing is the inlet where you put the sample in. But in fact, he's not talking about my instrument at all. He's talking about the other instruments right next to it. It's their inlet, which are trying to detect life. And the way we did it on Viking was those instruments trying to detect chemical reactions, or what biologists call metabolism, and determine if the soil had something in it that was undergoing chemical reactions that would be lifelike. And we didn't find any. Although one of the experimenters feels he did discover life, and it's been controversial ever since. But overall, we didn't discover it, and none of the missions since then have tried to repeat or expand on those experiments. Well, we've had various criticisms. Some people say you didn't search for the right thing. Some people say you just didn't look long enough, you didn't take enough pictures, or you would have seen something. Other people have said, well, life is going to be hard to find on Mars because it's kind of clever and we won't realize it's there when it really is. So what if we had done something like this? Now, we all recognize what this little gadget is, and on Mars the creature might look a lot different. But there's one clue with this particular type of life form that really tells us something, and that is, and I have a lot of these things in my backyard, and you probably do too. These things will be frozen for a while, and suddenly they'll dart upwards, opposite the direction of gravity. Now we have something you can't explain easily with physics. There are ways to move things upwards with physics, but certainly not the way these little guys move. And so motion can be a way to detect life. And I'll tell you, if you've ever been camping on a night where it's very dark and the campfire is small and you're out in a wilderness type area and you hear a rustling in the bushes, that's when you know you've detected life and you start wondering what it is. So one of the things that we wanted to do with Viking after the first 2 missions, which were just landers, was to replace the footpads with treads and to turn this into a rover. And we had one Viking left over, a flight one. NASA suddenly got very interested in building a shuttle and building a space station, and they just simply wouldn't use this leftover hardware, so we never got to do this. But it did get me to thinking that once we got this thing moving, what if there really were little green men on Mars somewhere, and what if they detected this thing and came out and started studying it? What would they think? I think they would think the darn thing was an alien. And it wouldn't look like them, but we probably don't either. So the reason it might look like an alien, an actual being, is that this thing, even though we know it's a robot, it has arms, it has legs, it has a way to communicate, it has 3 different mouths on it where you pick this gadget picks up soil and eats the stuff, and you know that it's warm-blooded because you can measure the temperatures, and we won't tell them that these are really nuclear power sources in there that create all the heat. So it has a lot of attributes of actually a life form. Well, let's talk about Mars a little bit now, because although we didn't detect life on Mars today, partly because it's a cold, dry desert type landscape, we know that in the past it really did have liquid water flowing, and so we have all these riverbed pictures. So that finally spurred NASA to become interested in Mars again about 20 years after Viking, and we started a new series of missions. It was too late to fly Viking as a rover because all the electronics in it were totally obsolete. So Jet Propulsion Laboratory, designed this new system using wheels. This is a rover, this is the solar array, so it's solar powered. And we landed on Mars 12 years ago now with 2 of these rovers. And this is one of the rovers named Spirit, which we put in some software. The engineers came up with software a couple of years after landing and installed it remotely. And they told the rover to drive straight towards this pile of rocks. But the software was supposed to analyze images from the rover and decide if it was safe to go forward. And obediently, the rover did exactly what we'd hoped it did. It went around the pile of rocks. Now, we didn't target it towards a pile of rocks that could have hurt it. But it didn't know that, and it avoided it. So this is one of the first self-driving cars, I guess. This rover did discover salt layers on Mars. These are actually wheel tracks. We told the engineers, let's go back, we want to sample this white material and compare it with this yellow material, and they said, no way are we going back into that stuff again. And in fact, this rover did get stuck eventually in some other soil, and unfortunately the solar array was pointed wrong, and so it died. But we had actually conducted about, 4 or 5 years of extensive exploration, made many discoveries with that rover. The other rover is now 12 years old and still going strong. Even though it has solar panels, and those solar panels get dusty, and the power goes down, 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 suddenly, every so often, there's what we just simply call a cleaning event. Suddenly the dust disappears, and we get sunlight again. Now, we think these are dust devils or some kind of atmospheric turbulence, but I don't know, it's a geophysics problem, let somebody say. So this is the latest rover. This is called Curiosity. It's about twice as big physically in dimensions, which makes it about 8 times as heavy, and it's loaded with quite a bit more science. So these are the various science instruments, and one of the things I think is interesting from your standpoint is that even though what we're analyzing is chemicals on Mars, the chemistry of the rocks and soils for the most part, and also just the morphology, taking pictures. All these instruments depend on physics one way or the other, almost all. The cameras depend on solid state devices. This is another type of X-ray fluorescence. This is a X-ray diffraction system buried down inside. We send the samples down to it. This uses a mass spectrometer. This is a neutron source scattering experiment that can detect hydrogen in the soil, and that's extremely important because we're looking for water. And this measures radiation environment of the vehicle. And then this is weather sensors. So the sensors themselves have brought a lot of physicists into the program. And some of the physicists have just simply retrained to learn geology so that they can write papers describing the importance of the results of what they're getting. So where we put this rover is inside a large crater called Gale Crater. And the reason we went there is not the crater, it's what's in it. It's this big mound of material. And from orbit, we can see that it has layers. And of course, when you see sedimentary layers on Earth, that means oil. Well, it can mean oil. Well, Mars has no oil, sorry. We wish we could find some organics there. We haven't so far. But otherwise, it means water. And so, wherever we can find sedimentary layers, especially if they have chemistries that imply that water was once there, that's of great, great interest. We might find within those the organic remains of organisms, or even microfossils. So, on the next rover mission, which won't be until 2020, we're actually going to take some empty tubes with us and fill those with samples. And then, in the following mission, and I may be too old to remember why we're doing it, they will bring those samples back to Earth, and we'll be able to analyze them in laboratories here. Here's where the rover has been traversing for the last 3.5 years. We're up here, and we've made quite a few discoveries here. This is what is remaining to come. We call this mound sharp. That is this mound, and you see the exquisite layering in it. And we know from orbit some of this is clay, some of it's salts, some of it's hematite. All these things imply water. Here's some of the layering we found down where we are now, and with the description by the geologists of what they think is going on. Rivers flowing into deltas, creating a lake and creating the sediments. So a wonderful environment for life, and it's a little hard to imagine that if you had a planet with plenty of water and all the geological resources to provide the various elements that life needs to, when you take your vitamins, there's also minerals, and you need those minerals. It's a little hard to imagine that you couldn't have had life, but so far we don't see any real signs of it. More evidence of chemistry. These are veins of calcium sulfate, which only form with water, and then this is found by Curiosity, and then we found similar but larger veins over with the Opportunity rover, the one that's still going. And then finally, we have a drill on Curiosity, so in this particular rock, it looks the same color as Mars, but that's just because it's covered with dust and dirt. And when we drill down, you see this gray material has a quite different composition than most of Mars. And over here is a rock that looked a little dark. And when we shot our laser at it, it allows us to do a remote analysis spectroscopically. We determined it had high manganese. So we put the X-ray fluorescence on it, and it verified that and got some other elements. And that's important because in rocks, you always have a low amount of manganese and a high amount of iron. And this all comes from the process of building up the periodic table in stars, is that you have a shift between odd and even in abundances. So manganese is low, iron is high. However, here, the iron was lower and the manganese was much higher. That only happens if you have water getting into the rock and dissolving out the manganese preferentially and moving it somewhere else, or vice versa, throwing out the iron. And that tells us a lot about what the pH and the oxidation conditions were when that water was there. So that's why it's important. But what about the search for life? And would we recognize it if we saw it? Because life can have so many different forms. We recognize this. We know that there's life there. But in fact, we can't see the living organism because we can't see the person inside the spacesuit. Everything that we see is actually artificial. here's a even more complicated case. This is Bruce McCandless, who was the astronaut to first fly in this untethered capability away from a space object, and this is the shuttle in this case. He's flying in something called the Manned Maneuvering Unit, which we built at our company at Martin Marietta. And Bruce then, after retired from the astronaut corps, came to work for us, and I ended up doing a couple of projects with him. But my point here is that this is part machine and part biology, part organism. Although again, you can't see the organism itself. Here's yet another astronaut, kind of a strange helmet. And I fooled you on this one. Now, why NASA is off developing a robot that looks like an astronaut is a little bit beyond me. I think it's because we all like to tinker with robots. We like to build them. We like to see what we can make them do. But it seems astronauts have enough trouble finding good things to do these days, and the last thing they need is robots to take their place. This is some ideas on robots that come from a movie called Metropolis back in 1927, and it was actually at the time the most expensive movie ever made. They introduced the idea of robots. And you'll see that Maria in that movie looks surprisingly similar to C-3PO in Star Wars. But Star Wars didn't bother to tell us they were plagiarizing, but frankly, I like Maria a little better. This is the first sort of implementation of a robot. It was built by the company called Westinghouse, and back in 1937. And you see that it's very large. And it's not because it was meant to be imposing. It was because in those days, we had no transistors. We had no integrated circuits. We had no laptop computers. So all we had was vacuum tubes. In fact, when I went to the University of Oklahoma, it was so long ago that when I built my music system, my sound system, it was all vacuum tubes. But today, this guy can be made much smaller. Now, in one of the early science fiction movies, one of my favorites, The Day the Earth Stood Still, their robot was big also, and he had a laser coming out of his helmet that could destroy weapons and so forth. His name was Gort, and the hero of the movie really was the alien Klaatu. So, over a period of time, robots have developed more and more and have gotten more capable and smaller. This is a effort by Honda Corporation, and this is the robot Asimov, they call it, but it's named after Isaac Asimov, who was a physicist who wrote terrific books on science, and he would cover biology and chemistry as well as physics. And he also wrote a lot of sci-fi, including the book I, Robot. So this Asimov robot can walk downstairs, without holding the handrails. Someday I won't be able to do that myself. And he can stand on one foot, but he got a lot bigger feet than we do. And he can even play the trumpet. Oh, and I forgot to point out, I'm going to go back to Electro for a minute. Over here it tells all the things he can do: speak 700 words, move his head and arms, and smoke a cigarette. It's very important in those days. So there are even robots that play soccer that are being developed. Amazing. And there's quite an effort to develop robots that are empathetic with us, or we're empathetic with them. In other words, they attack our emotions. This particular blog says this. They consider this robot to be creepy looking. Maybe I agree, but here's the key thing. This robot is just a mechanical electronic contraption. It's not alive in any sense of the word. It may kind of seem alive and act alive and look alive, but there's nothing truly alive about it. So life on Earth, though, is extraordinarily diverse, and not everything does look like us. And in fact, some things are kind of ugly. Oops. Well, you can see the shrew down in the bottom and the rose just above it. We have very, very small life forms, bacteria, And we had at one time huge ones, and we still have whales, which are huge. And it turns out, when I ran the numbers, the ratio in mass of this living organism to the mass of this living organism is, it turns out, about Avogadro's number right now, 10 to the 22 or so, maybe 10 to the 23. So life can span a huge range of sizes and behaviors and capabilities and many, many different things. But surprisingly, what was discovered many years ago now is that every form of life we know of is based on very fundamentally the same biochemistry. So we have DNA, we have proteins, and we have the material that makes up the cell walls, which is fatty acids formed into lipids. So this is one way we could search for life, is to search for these chemicals, because these chemicals don't occur in a geologic sense. None of these do. Although in some meteorites we have found some amino acids, not exactly the same amino acids we have in our life, but some amino acids are made in meteorites. So the last couple of days, Monday and Tuesday, I was at Jet Propulsion Lab working with a group of scientists, includes some international scientists as well as engineers. We're going to propose a mission to a place that could conceivably have life that's not Mars. This is a moon of Saturn called Enceladus. It's been discovered by a mission called Cassini, when it can take close-up pictures that it had these lineaments on it. And I was there when these were discovered, and somebody nicknamed them tiger stripes, so we've been calling them that for quite a while now. Then a few years later, the same mission discovered that these stripes are actually emitting plumes of gas. And about 100 plumes have now been imaged so far. These things are continuous. So it's kind of like having Old Faithful geyser on this planet erupting continuously, not every so many minutes. And they've now flown through these plumes to a certain amount, and with an infrared spectrometer been able to detect that there's organic material in these plumes. So what's going on at Enceladus? It's not large enough to have heat the way we normally think of it, volcanic heat. But it apparently is being tidally pumped by other moons as it goes around Saturn and depositing energy within it. Now basically it's an ice ball. The outside is ice. The next layer is liquid water underneath that. So it's a subterranean ocean that's coming through the cracks. And then we think down at the core of it is probably a central core of silicates and organic material. And once you have all these ingredients together, you can make life. So we're putting together a concept for a mission that's going to fly through these plumes, that we're going to have much better instruments than Cassini did, and we're going to look for the DNA ingredients, the protein ingredients, and the phospholipid ingredients, chemically. And if we do find really good signatures, it could be one of the most important discoveries the space program will have ever made. So it's a very exciting proposal. It won't even get evaluated and selected for about another year and a half. The mission won't happen for a few years beyond that. So it's kind of a thought of things to come. So how do you define life then, other than the biochemistry? Because maybe life doesn't have the same chemistry on all planets. Different biologists have come up with different criteria, and they talk about various attributes. Oparin was one of the earliest. Didot won a Nobel Prize for other work. Many very good biologists. This was published in Science. But these criteria are all different, all not the same, let's put it that way. Some of them there's some redundancy, but in general they're not the same. Different opinions on what is life. And I would argue that these aren't even the right way to go about it, because you can take a phenomenon such as fire and find that it matches 3 or 4 of the attributes. Fire does grow. It does reproduce itself. It creates new fires remotely. And it performs the same chemistry that we do. We eat organics, combine it with oxygen in the air to drive energy, and it does exactly the same thing. Not quite as controlled as we do. So I expanded the list of attributes, and I came up with about 100 different attributes that you could ascribe to life as opposed to the other sciences. And you'll see, though, that biochemists prefer some of these attributes, physiologists others, and there's still other groups of people that have different things. So I think attributes is the wrong way to go. I'd like to liken it to something we learned in physics. So after Galileo, Kepler was doing very excellent studies of the motions of the planets using telescopes and deducing various relationships. And I don't know how many he deduced, but it was more than these three. These are the celebrated three. He figured out that they weren't really going in circles, they were going in elliptical orbits, and then these other relationships between the way they moved. But these are all attributes. And along came Newton later, and I don't think he looked in telescopes, I think he was just watching the apple orchard or something. He came up with his laws, the law of relating force and mass and acceleration, plus the law of gravity. And from those laws, plus he had to invent calculus on the side so he could do it, he was able to deduce all of Kepler's laws. So Kepler's laws are really just attributes. They are not the fundamental explanation. And it was Newton that came up with the really fundamental thing. And by the way, these two laws is all we need to send rockets to Mars, and to do it extraordinarily accurately. So there's other things about physics we don't need yet in the space program, but those various instruments I showed you, many of them depend on quantum mechanics and other phenomena. So let's take a crack at defining what is life. And this is my crack at it. And so I started out with it being a physical entity. Let's forget about computer simulations of life, even though computer viruses are very similar to life forms. And it has to have an ability to reproduce. That's everyone does agree with that property. And what I add is that in a suitable environment, meaning that it doesn't have to be able to reproduce anytime, anywhere, under any conditions. But once it's in the correct environment, if it can reproduce, that can make it alive. But a little bit more, that its reproduction is enabled by a set of instructions that are embedded in this unit. So, for example, crystals can form, and they're highly regular. They sort of look like a system that could be living, but crystals don't have embedded instructions, and they're always the same. If we create a solution that can crystallize, the crystal will form in a certain, what's called the crystal habit, what geologists call minerals, and that's the same all the time. Life can change, and that's because of the instructions. So let's look at the suitable environment first. The various bacteria there are various bacteria that can thrive under cold conditions and some under very hot conditions, even above the temperature of boiling water. However, each set of organisms are specialists. So the ones that live well at low temperature we call psychrophiles, the ones that live well at high temperatures we call thermophiles or hyperthermophiles. And then also, all these organisms prefer certain pHs of the medium that they live in. So they can only live and grow and reproduce if the environment is suitable for them. And if it's not, they either die or they become dormant and resistant. Bacteria can form something called a spore, which is almost like a hunk of plastic. It does nothing. You would think it was totally dead, but you put that spore in a rich nutrient medium, and within 24 hours, you will have millions of bacteria. So, an oak tree, which is what the squirrel was climbing, is also alive, but the bark is not particularly alive. It's pretty inert. And the oak tree does not reproduce by just getting larger and then splitting in half and making two oak trees. Now that's the way a bacterium would do it. That's not the way the oak tree does. So the oak sends down this little thing, this little acorn, and it will sit there forever and do nothing until conditions are suitable. Once they're suitable, you have good moisture, maybe other factors, temperature, then it does what it does really well, and that is because it's got inside it a set of instructions. The instructions say, go build something upward and build another thing downward and make them different functions, different properties, and so forth. All that's pre-coded inside that little acorn, and it becomes an oak tree. Another suitable environment has to do with other organisms. So there are many organisms that live on or in close relationship with other organisms. And some biologists tend to shun away from such things. They prefer what they call the free living organism as being the independent thing. So you have predators, which means an animal eats another animal, herbivores, which means the animal eats a plant. We both do that. That's what keeps us alive. And you have parasites, which means that the organism lives in or on another organism. And parasites can be very bad, but also there are other cases where organisms live together, mutualists and commensalists, where it doesn't really hurt either one, and it may benefit one or both. But at least one of those organisms needs the other organism. And in reality, there is a lot of the top stuff going on. Parasites are extremely abundant. We have plenty of bacteria within us. Some people say 10 to 1 cells to cells, although now the latest thought is it's more like 1 bacterium for every human cell in our bodies. But nonetheless, we don't exactly invite them inside us, but it also looks like they're doing us some good in general. These are the good bacteria. And most of them, by the way, are E. coli, but not the E. coli you've heard so much about. That's a particular strain that is toxic. So a lot of organisms depend on other organisms. And in fact, where we're looking at Enceladus is what would be called a chemolithoautotroph, which means it gets its energy from chemicals, not from the sun. Because it can't see the sun, it's down inside this ocean. And it gets also its building blocks from minerals. But overall, if you look at all the organisms in the biosphere, a huge number of them are dependent on other organisms. And so that's my list there. You can just see that. So the instructions help us to distinguish, as I said, between living matter and natural matter, inanimate matter. Organisms can become diverse and they can become improved. A rainbow is always a rainbow with all the various properties, the colors, the double rainbow. See this light zone inside the dark zone? All of that is fixed by the laws of physics. It never changes, maybe in intensity, and that's about it. You never do get to the pot of gold, unfortunately. This bird, for reasons unknown, mimics the color sequence of the rainbow, which I find interesting. But it's not a rainbow, he's alive. And also, because you have instructions in organisms, you have what we would consider to be computer capability. You have memory. You can have algorithms, and you do. The DNA is not just a memory bank. There's a whole set of instructions embedded in it on how to implement those instructions in the organism. And Darwinian evolution just means that the way things evolve is that the instruction set changes, the DNA changes through mutations. And if it's a good mutation, that's great. If it's a bad mutation, natural selection kills you off. You don't survive. Lamarckian evolution means you have a feedback loop, and you can actually adapt those instructions. We don't have much of that in the biological world, very little. So once you have an instruction set, though, you're automatically going to have evolution. You don't have to invoke evolution as being a property of life, but it's going to be a consequence. It's sort of like deriving something from an axiom or a fundamental. And that's because you can't make perfect copies of instructions. There are just many, many different reasons, and it turns out biology is smart enough not to make an absolute error correction system, because then nothing would ever change, nothing could ever improve. Well, back to robots. What do robots robots have to do it? Well, robots can make things. In fact, we use them all the time to make things. And in fact, the robot industry just continues to grow, and I was rather amazed that in China there are so many different robot manufacturers now. Japan also is huge in the robotics and always has been. And they have a labor shortage, or at least they think they do, and so they want robots. But not all robots really do have to be androids. That is, they don't have to look like humans. In fact, for certain functions, it doesn't make sense for them to be little Marias or C-3POs. And so robots can run on wheels. This was a very old one developed at Stanford. It was first test bed for artificial intelligence. These are more advanced, newer ones. These are robots with arms. This guy up here is making pancakes. This guy down here is doing inventory. You know, when you order something from Amazon, they have these huge warehouses. They have these robots that go around. Next thing, they not only pick out your inventory, they figure out what size of box it goes into, so forth and so on. And unfortunately, there are other applications for robots that are getting a lot of money and a lot of attention. And we can't argue with it too much because it saves this guy's life if we can send robots into the field and perform functions that otherwise we would have to send a soldier to do. But I think it's scary, because it's possible and it's also being done. Here's one that really looks scary. This is a really high caliber, high throughput weapon system. Just a little robot could go lots of places, do lots of things. So what I'm worried about is what's known as the rise of the machines. This is what you see in science fiction literature and quite a few movies. The usual thought is that we will get machine computation that is so good that it can outsmart us in terms of its intelligence. And so Ray Kurzweil, who's at MIT, has been associated with MIT, has been championing this for a long time. He calls it the singularity. Once we have a machine that is so smart that it is smarter than any human being. I doubt that it's even possible, but I'm also not as worried about it. Now, it's made some great movies like Terminator, then before that, War Games, which was a great movie, I thought, and Colossus before that, a little old-fashioned, but all these movies hypothesize a machine that's actually to help defend us, against nuclear attack, but the machine sort of takes over, and the next thing you know, it's running the whole world, or at least the whole military. But it seems to me all you really have to do to control machines like that, if we can create them. And in some ways it would be wonderful because we can, feed in all the information, the accumulated knowledge of doctors on diagnosing diseases, and the machine would be able to do it like that. And if you went to the machine, you would get the combined wisdom of thousands of doctors, not just take your luck with your local doctor. But if the machine like that did try to become independent and take over, just walk over to the wall socket and pull the darn plug. And make sure the backup power systems are inactivated. And maybe cut off its access to the internet and the outside world. But as long as we know where that machine is, we should be able to control it. I'm worried about something much more analogous to life. Because life doesn't operate that way either. We're a whole variety of organisms in this room together, and outside us are thousands and thousands of other species of organisms, all individuals, and if we kill one, there's still many, many more left. We just can't get rid of them. And so what I'm worried about is if we ever build a robot which can build copies of itself, because we have embedded within it the instruction set on how to do that, and then this thing gets loose, how do we ever get rid of it? We can go exterminate it. We could hunt them down. They can hide very easily. It wouldn't be hard. But if we could hunt them all down and kill every last one, what we're going to find out is they weren't so dumb that they didn't make backup copies of their instruction set. And these backup copies could be in computers and servers and flash drives and big machines. They could be all over the place. And there could be a little virus associated with them that says, gee, if, on a certain date, or if I haven't heard, or whatever, I'm going to activate these instructions, and I'm going to go out onto Amazon, I'm going to buy all the parts I need, I'm going to hire somebody, and I'm going to put myself back together again. So, to me, it's a dilemma. If we ever really let robots be like life, and these robots fit my definition of life. They can reproduce themselves, and they have embedded instructions to do it with. And because they have instruction set, that software can be improved, so they can evolve. And they can evolve way faster than we as individuals could ever evolve. So it's just a concern, and it's part of, I think, what we have to call safe science. When we're doing science and engineering, we have to do things that are for our own safety. Enrico Fermi died at the age of 53 of cancer. That cancer came because he had built that first reactor. So he gets a lot of celebration for building the reactor. He gets less celebration for the fact that he essentially gave his life doing it. And two of his grad students died of cancer young also, the same reason. But that was because they didn't know, they didn't understand the dangers of ionizing radiation in those days. And we do today. But it's an example of where you have to do safe things. We as scientists have to help control the thing that we created, the nuclear bomb, and the fusion bomb, and the fission bomb. And we ourselves need to be responsible about genetic engineering. That's pretty close to being out of control with new technology in the last couple of years. It's worrisome also. And I think these robots are worrisome. But we'll still keep looking for life in other places in the universe, and I hope SETI keeps looking for those communicators, because once we communicate with somebody, who knows what we can learn.